In the early months of 1984, 5 young white women were raped or assaulted in Richmond, Virginia by a man fitting the description of a young black male. After one of the victims claimed that her attacker was 18-year-old Thomas Hainsworth, the police took him in as a suspect. Eventually, all 5 victims identified him as their attacker, and he was convicted of 2 rapes, 1 attempted robbery, and 1 abduction, and was sentenced to 73 years in prison. Thomas spent 27 years in prison before the real perpetrator, Leon Davis, was rightfully convicted for his crimes. Thomas Hainsworth was wrongfully convicted because of false, non-biological evidence, faulty eyewitnesses. DNA evidence proved Thomas's innocence and helped lead to Leon Davis. Was it fair that Thomas was convicted based on the word of 5 women? Was it fair that it was his words against theirs when there was no other evidence found to link him to these crimes? Is there something wrong with the criminal justice system? How did no one ever stop to think, maybe we got the wrong guy? Let's look further into Thomas Hainsworth's story. On January 3, 1984, a 20-year-old white woman named Janet Burke was raped at knife point in a daycare center where she worked in Richmond, Virginia by a young black male. The same attacker went on to rape 4 more women around the East End neighborhood of Richmond in less than 5 weeks. He had developed a similar pattern in each of his assaults. On January 21st, the second victim was an 18-year-old woman who was held at knife point near a grocery store. On January 27th, the third victim was a woman who was approached outside her home by a man demanding money and sex. She ended up locking herself inside and called the police while the man fled. On January 30th, the fourth victim was an 18-year-old woman who was abducted and raped in nearby Henrico County within blocks of the other attacks. And on February 1st, the fifth victim was a 19-year-old woman who was abducted at gunpoint outside her home, but the attacker fled when the woman's dog began barking. The police believed it was one man responsible because the given locations, description of the attacker, and nature of the attacks was consistent. Each attack was early in the morning, and he would always talk to the women as he approached them. He would say things such as, "Don't scream," and "I've used this knife before, and I'll do it again." Hainsworth's photo was shown to the other 4 victims in photo arrays, and all 4 identified him as their attacker. There were no other suspects. The police lineup contained young black men that fit the description of the attacker. All the victims claimed it was Thomas after seeing his face. The police did not find any evidence. The police searched his house and didn't find a knife or a gun, which was the selected weapon of the attacker. The strongest evidence they had was all 5 victims claiming that Thomas was their attacker. Thomas was charged with rape, sodomy, abduction, use of a firearm, and robbery and was taken to court. In this case, it was Thomas's word against all 5 women. He continued to claim his innocence after he was taken to trial. Thomas's attorney argued that this was a case of mistaken identity and that the eyewitnesses picked the wrong guy. Thomas's family testified on his behalf, and he had a good alibi. He was home the morning of Janet's attack. He woke up around 10 in the morning as he usually did, and the family remembered that day very well because that was the day they finally took down their Christmas tree. His primary witness was his mom, but she was not a very good witness because a mom would lie for her son, and it is very easy for prosecutors to exploit that. During the trial, the prosecutor asked the first victim, Janet, if she was 100% positive that Thomas was the man who raped her, and she responded with, "He got a face I will never forget." However, Janet described the perpetrator to be taller than her. She remembers his height as he walked past her doorframe. Janet was 5'8", and Thomas was only 5'6½". The charges were dropped from the January 27th case as it never went to trial, despite that victim being the first to identify him. Nevertheless, Thomas was convicted of 2 rapes, 1 attempted robbery, and 1 attempted abduction, and was sentenced to a total of 73 years in prison. Thomas was doomed from the beginning. The way the criminal justice system works made it very difficult to prove his innocence. Once he was found guilty solely off the evidence of a positive eyewitness, it made it even more difficult to fight in trial. After Hainsworth was arrested and convicted, the rapes continued in the same neighborhood. The rapist began telling women that he was called the Black Ninja and raped over a dozen young females. These attacks had a similar pattern of the ones Thomas was convicted of. The MO appeared to be the same. On December 19, 1984, the police arrested Leon Davis after a couple saw him following uncomfortably close to a woman on the street. Leon Davis was convicted of rape, robbery, and malicious wounding. He was sentenced to a 4-life term plus 100 years in prison. The rape stopped after Leon was arrested. Thomas's appeal had been denied even after Leon's arrest. All of Hainsworth's cases had worked their way through the system by October 1984. Thus, by the time Davis was caught, no one bothered to revisit the crimes for which Hainsworth had been charged. No one stopped to think that Leon could have been responsible for the rapes Thomas was charged with. After the Innocence Project was created by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld to help the wrongfully convicted in 1992, the Senator of Virginia, Patrick Leahy, introduced a bill in the year 2000 that would make DNA testing available to all inmates who claim it would prove their innocence. In 2001, Virginia Governor Mark Warner ordered a review of cases between 1973 and 1988, and it was discovered that the semen recovered from the victim of Hainsworth's January 3rd rape conviction matched Davis's and not Hainsworth's. With this knowledge, Hainsworth's legal team reached out to Richmond and Henrico's Commonwealth's attorney to review his other convictions. Even though there was no physical evidence for the other 2 convictions, DNA testing proved Davis was the perpetrator in these cases as well. The Richmond and Henrico Commonwealth's attorneys conducted an extensive investigation and eventually concluded that Davis, not Hainsworth, was responsible for all of the crimes attributed to Thomas. They discovered that the MO of Hainsworth's convictions was the same for Davis's. Hainsworth also passed polygraph tests regarding his conviction. While the petition was pending before the Court of Appeals, Governor Bob McDonnell asked the state parole board to reconsider Hainsworth's request for parole, which had been denied repeatedly. On March 21, 2011, Hainsworth was granted parole and was released from prison after serving 27 years. On December 6, 2011, Hainsworth was fully exonerated. Personally, I believe that Thomas should have received a more fair case the first time it was tried. There was no other evidence beside confident eyewitnesses. Even though research in the past has shown that self-assured eyewitnesses during a trial testimony is extremely persuasive, I do not believe they should have convicted a very young man of a serious crime when there was no biological evidence involved. The victims were just kids, and they didn't deserve what happened to them, but neither did Hainsworth. Even though I do not agree with Hainsworth's conviction, I understand why it happened that way. There were no other suspects or evidence to link someone else to the crimes. The 5 women did not falsely identify him on purpose. Research has shown that it is hard for people of a certain race to easily tell apart people of a different race. For instance, all of the victims are white and both Davis and Hainsworth are African American. Mistaking Hainsworth for Davis was not an act of racism, but a fault in their memory. The biggest misconceptions about eyewitness memory is that when an event is extremely stressful or traumatic, an individual is more likely to be accurate in their recollection and in their identifications that follow. But research suggests that they are more likely to make errors. And even though Janet said that Hainsworth had a face she will never forget, she had convinced herself that this was her attacker. She even said she didn't have a connection to Leon's picture after he was proven to be her rapist. Research has shown that once our brain has connected 2 things, it is very difficult to disconnect them, even when presented with new facts. Also, I believe that the victims mistakenly identified Hainsworth because they felt like they were answering a multiple-choice question when presented with the photo array. When the victims got a call to come down to the police station to identify their attacker, they got the impression that he was caught and they had to pick from the photos given. It was just unfortunate that Hainsworth had a similar appearance to Davis. Hainsworth was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. The appeal to using DNA evidence is very important. DNA can convict or exonerate defendants, link a person to a crime, eliminate suspects, and much more. In Hainsworth's case, an advancement in DNA testing technology and available DNA testing proved his innocence and saved his life. Without DNA evidence, Hainsworth could have spent the rest of his life in jail. Although, DNA evidence is not always reliable in court because of imperfect DNA testing. If the scientist is sloppy, imperfect, or prioritizes results over accuracy, then the results are false and not trustworthy. There is no guarantee that the DNA evidence is 100% correct. But I still believe that DNA evidence is important to use in court because it can sometimes be extremely reliable to directly link a person to a crime. In 2012, the General Assembly passed a bill granting over $1 million to Hainsworth for wrongful imprisonment, but no amount of money can take back the years he spent suffering in prison. Now, Thomas Hainsworth has started the new chapter in his life and is building his future as a free man. He is just one example of someone who got their life back because of the Innocence Project.